If there is a good God, why is there evil? That's a question everybody needs to answer who's a Christian or even just a theist. If there is a good God, why all this evil in the world? So that's the question we're going to try and tackle tonight. And I'd like to start actually in Mexico City. 1985, there was an earthquake, a deadly earthquake. And a great Christian apologist by the name of William Lane Craig, who debates atheists quite frequently on college campuses. I've only done a couple of debates. He's probably done about 50. He's written a book here called Hard Questions, Real Answers. He has a very disturbing account of what actually occurred in that earthquake in 1985, and also the same year what occurred in a mudslide in Colombia, South America. Here's what he writes in his book, Hard Questions, Real Answers. In 1985, the horror of natural events was brought home to me in a powerful way through two incidents on television. In Mexico City, a terrible earthquake had devastated blocks of high-rise apartment buildings. You can see they just collapsed right upon people. As rescue teams in the aftermath of the quake searched the rubble for survivors, they came across a 10-year-old boy who they could hear, but they couldn't get to. He was trapped alive somewhere in the recesses of the collapsed building. During the next several days, the whole world watched in agony as teams began to remove rubble to try and find the boy. The boy's grandfather had already died, and the boy kept yelling, "I'm scared, I'm scared." After about 11 days of searching, there was silence. Alone in the darkness, trapped without food, afraid, the little boy died before rescue teams could get to him. Where was God? Same year, 1985, a mudslide swept over a village in Colombia. As rescuers came to help survivors, they came across a little girl who was pinned up to her chin in muddy water. For some reason or other, they could not free her or remove the water. All they could do was stand by helplessly and watch her die. Every night on the news, we saw films of the little girl's decline. It was the most pathetic sight I had ever seen. She stood there, unable to move, spitting out the water that continually flowed into her mouth. As the days went by, she became more exhausted, and deep black circles formed under her eyes. She was dying before our very eyes as we watched on television. Finally, the evening newscaster reported that she was gone. Where was God? Here's what Craig says. Those two incidents rent my heart. Oh God, I thought, how could you permit those children to die like that? If they had to die, so be it. But you could have let the boy be killed instantly by the collapse of the building or let the girl drown suddenly. Why these torturous, pointless, slow deaths? To be honest with you, when I see these sort of things, it makes me very skeptical about belief in God. Makes it hard for me to believe in God. Same for me. How about you? Where's God? What's going on? How about more recently? Katrina, 2005. After the disaster, chaos and lawlessness ruled the streets. Just help us. Why didn't God help? Where was God? These are very difficult questions, and hopefully we'll try and uncover some answers here tonight. Here's what we're going to try and do. Of course, another tragedy, 9/11. Where was God there? Here's what we're going to try and do tonight. First thing, does evil disprove God? If there's evil in the world, does that mean God doesn't exist? I mean, if He's all-powerful and all good, and yet there's evil in the world, how can there be this all-powerful good God? We have to answer that question. Secondly, did God create evil? If God is all good, why do we have such a thing as evil? And if He created all things, and evil certainly is a thing, then He must have created evil. How could He be all good and create evil? Well, let's try and answer that. Thirdly, what's the source of evil? Where does it come from? Why does it exist? Number 4, what's the purpose of evil? Is there any purpose to this? Is there any purpose to these people dying? Particularly torturous deaths. Is there any purpose for 9/11? Is there any purpose for the Holocaust? Are there any answers to this? Or are we just skipping along, believing in our little fairy tale God in the sky, unable to reconcile evil with who we really believe in? 5, what's the destiny of evil? What ultimately is going to happen? And if Christianity really is indeed true, what should you do about it? What should you do about evil? That's what we're going to try and cover tonight. You guys ready to go? All right. What is the issue with evil? Does evil disprove God? Now, whenever you look at any topic, you have to look at the topic in context. Some people think evil is the knockout blow for God. But you really need to look at all the evidence, because you have to see all the evidence in context before you try and conclude whether or not God exists. So let's make a 2-column chart here. Does God exist? We'll give evidence for God existing on the left, and we'll give evidence for Him not existing on the right. And when I mean God here, I'm talking about a theistic God, a God beyond the world, who created the world and sustains the world and intervenes in it from time to time. What's the evidence that He does exist? Well, the universe and time itself had a beginning. And what I mean by the universe, I mean all space, all matter, and all time. Once there was no space, no matter, or time, and then it all leapt into existence out of absolutely nothing. I'll save the details till tomorrow, but it's all in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Okay? And by the way, that all the proceeds from the sale of the book will go to feed needy children. Mine. Okay, just so you know. I've got some needy children out there. Got 3 boys, 2 of them are in college, so I need some help. In any event, the evidence for what I'm putting up here on the left is in another book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I don't have time to give you all the evidence tonight. I'm just going to list it, okay? Also, the design of the universe. Not only did the universe explode into being out of nothing, it did so with great precision. There's incredible design in the universe. So the implication is there's a designer. There's also design in life, as we'll see tomorrow night as well. What about the 4 natural forces? We talk about natural law all the time, but they're really, to be truthful about it, natural law doesn't do anything. Natural law is the description that we use to describe how the 4 natural forces interact to cause things naturally here on earth. Does anyone know what the 4 natural forces are? Any scientists in here? I'll give you a hint. If I were to release this, one of the 4, gravity would be one of them, okay? Then there are the strong and weak nuclear forces, and finally, electromagnetism. So you got gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and then electromagnetism. Those are the only 4 natural forces we know about. They are very regular and very precise. The question is, where did they come from? Where do these forces come from? Why are they so regular? Why are they so orderly? Why are they so precise? Seems to point back to someone who has order, precision, and decided to put these laws into place. Life and consciousness. Where does life come from? Darwinists think they have it figured out. Not where life comes from, but where subsequent life form comes from. But that doesn't answer the question of where the first life came from, even if Darwinism were completely true, which I don't think it is. But even if it were completely true, they have no explanation from where the first life came from. And as we'll see tomorrow night, it's incredibly designed. It's the product of a mind. It's not the product of natural forces operating on non-living chemicals. More on that tomorrow night. And consciousness, where does that come from? How about morality? Where does objective morality come from? Everybody knows that it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Where does that law come from? Where does the law come from? You ought not murder. Even if there's just one morally wrong thing out there, or one morally right thing, like love, there has to be a source of that morality. We'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. The laws of logic and reason. My recent debate with Christopher Hitchens. One of my arguments for God is that there's immaterial laws out there known as the laws of reason or the laws of logic. I said, Christopher, by you showing up at this debate tonight, you are implicitly admitting there's an immaterial standard of truth that you can get at by using the immaterial laws of logic. In your worldview, which is completely atheistic, he's a materialist. He thinks that the only things that exist are physical things. We're just glorified chemicals from the periodic table. That's all we are. That's his worldview. He doesn't have in his worldview an immaterial standard of reason, yet he's using it to debate me. He's saying he's closer to that standard than I am. Anytime you have a debate, you're implying that there's a standard there, and you're saying that you're closer to that standard of truth than your opponent. Well, he doesn't have that standard in his worldview. If atheism is true, you shouldn't believe it. Why? Because you're just molecules in motion. Even Darwin said, look, if my brain is the product of lower animals, why should I even believe what my brain tells me? It's called Darwin's doubt. So this is an argument, it seems to me, for a being who's reasonable. He's the standard of reason. You say, did God create logic? No, God is logic. God is the standard. Also, the laws of mathematics. 2 plus 2 equals 4 everywhere. Why is that? If nothing existed, would 2 plus 2 still equal 4? Yes, if you don't need objects to prove it, 2 plus 2 equals 4. How about the statement? Suppose nothing existed, including God. How about the statement that says, there is no God? Would that statement be true? Yeah, it would be true. There is no God if there was nothing. It would be true. But of course, there would be no truth unless there was God. So it's kind of a conundrum there. If God just existed and he created nothing, he was just him, would the statement that the only thing that exists is God, would that be true? Of course. It's an immaterial thing. When Christopher Hitchens and other atheists say there is no God, they're using the standard of logic to try and say there is no God. But they don't have that standard in their worldview. They have to borrow from theism to argue against it. When they do mathematical equations, they have to borrow from theism in order to do it. Intelligence. Where does intelligence come from? Either intelligence comes from mind or it comes from matter. How can we get intelligence from just matter? How do chemicals have intelligence? They don't. Mind comes from mind. You have a mind because there is a great mind called God who gave you a mind. This is simple laws of causality stuff. Where does personality come from? Isn't it amazing that there are 6 billion people in the world, and while we do have some similarities, everybody has their own personality. How do you get different personalities from the 4 natural forces that do the same thing over and over again? Where does that come from? It can't. There's something other than just the 4 natural forces. And as I mentioned before, where do the 4 natural forces come from? Seems to point back to a mind. How about Old Testament prophecy? Now we're getting into biblical stuff. How do you explain some of the Old Testament prophecies if there is no God? Were they just good guessers? There's too many things in there. By the way, if I had to lay my whole case on one prophecy in the Old Testament, it would be Isaiah 53. And if you don't know what Isaiah 53 is, you need to go home and read it, because it's obviously referring to Christ, yet we know beyond any doubt that it was written well before Christ. In fact, the greatest discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was a 24-foot-long, complete book of Isaiah that they know comes from at least 100 BC. And in there is the chapter, actually begins in chapter 52, but then it goes to the complete chapter, chapter 53. An amazing prophecy looking forward to a Messiah who would be wounded for our transgressions. You need to go read that. Now, I think actually Christians overuse messianic prophecy because some of them are not very clear, at least not to a skeptic. But Isaiah 53 is certainly a very clear one. So check into that. Finally, the resurrection. If the New Testament documents tell the truth, and of course that's a big if I haven't proven here, but we do in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, then clearly that's evidence for God, who raised Jesus from the dead. So you've got all of these arguments, or all of these reasons to believe in God on this side of the equation, and maybe we could add some more, I'm sure we could if we thought about it, but that ought to be enough. What's the major argument against God? The major argument against a good God is evil. But actually, evil does not really turn out to be a knockout blow to the belief in God. Why not? Because evil is actually an argument for God, because objective evil presupposes objective good, and there is no objective good unless there's a standard of good, and that standard is God's very nature. The shadows prove the sunshine. Why are there shadows? Because there's sunshine. If there were no sunshine, there'd be no shadows. You'll see what I mean by this a little bit later when we get into what really is evil. But the main point here is that the argument against God because of evil actually is a backhanded way of arguing for God, because you wouldn't know evil unless you knew good, and you wouldn't know good unless there was a standard of good outside yourself, and that indeed would be God. C.S. Lewis said this the most eloquently of anybody probably, and if you haven't read Mere Christianity yet, consider yourself uneducated. One of the greatest books ever written on Christianity was Mere Christianity, where C.S. Lewis tried to say, what are the mere fundamentals, the basic things that all Christians agree on? And he starts out by talking about the moral law argument for the existence of God. And Lewis, for quite a while, was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. And one of the reasons he didn't believe in God was because all the injustice in the world, all the evil in the world. And one day Lewis had an epiphany. Lewis, by the way, was a friend of Tolkien, the man who wrote, of course, the entire series on the Lord of the Rings. Gee, I'm losing my mind here. Lord of the Rings. And of Lewis, as you know, as a novelist himself, he wrote the whole Narnia series as well. So Lewis was quite an eclectic and intelligent guy who wrote not only apologetics, but novels, and I even think he may have even gotten into poetry at one point. But he was an amazing writer, an amazing intellect. But Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, says this about his argument against God, about all the injustice in the world. He said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. You wouldn't know what a crooked line was unless you knew what a straight line was. You wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. And you wouldn't know what justice was unless there was a standard of justice beyond yourself. Lewis goes on to say, look, if it's just my personal opinion that there's evil in the world, then my personal opinion is not a real argument against God. See, if I admit there's real evil in the world, I have to admit there's a standard of good. Now, for those of you who were in here the other night, let me just say this is going to be review here for just a minute, but let me just point this out, that if there is no God, then you can't say that this was really wrong. 9/11. Oh, you could say you didn't like it. You could say it was inconvenient. You could say it made you sad, but you can't say it was objectively morally wrong. Why not? Well, because that's just your opinion against bin Laden's opinion. It's just two human beings arguing here. If there's no standard beyond humanity, who's to say you're right? Well, there is no right. It's just your opinion. Same thing. If there is no God, you can't say that this was morally wrong. The Holocaust. That's just your opinion. It's just your opinion against Hitler's opinion. Now, every sane individual intuitively understands that this is objectively morally wrong. It's not just your opinion. It's not just something like a taste or a flavor. It's objectively morally wrong. And if it's objectively morally wrong, there has to be somebody who made it objectively morally wrong. Every prescription has a prescriber. If there is a prescription on humanity that says this is wrong and say love is right, then somebody must have prescribed it. Suppose you go to the pharmacist with a prescription and you hand it to him, and he says, hey, who prescribed this? And you go, nobody. Are you going to get the medicine? No. All prescriptions have prescribers, and there is a prescription out there. In fact, you can look at it this way. How do you know who's right and who's wrong, Mother Teresa or Hitler? How do you know who's right and who's wrong? A standard. There's got to be a standard. Mother Teresa's not the standard. Hitler's not the standard. In fact, here's an easy way of looking at this. How do you know which map of Scotland is better? What would you need to see? You'd have to see a real place called Scotland. And when you see a real, unchanging place called Scotland, you can see that map A, while it's not perfect, is a better representation of the real Scotland than is map B. If Scotland doesn't exist, these two maps are meaningless, right? Likewise, if there's no standard of morality beyond Mother Teresa and Hitler, then anything you say about their morality or immorality is meaningless as well. That's just your opinion. But since here, real Scotland does exist, we can see that map A is better. Not perfect, but better. That's exactly what you do when you compare Mother Teresa and Hitler. Mother Teresa wasn't the standard. Hitler wasn't the standard. There's a standard beyond both of them by which we measure both of them. And we say Mother Teresa lived up to that standard better than did Hitler. Again, C.S. Lewis said it best. He said, the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other, but the standard that measures two things is something different from either. When you measure Mother Teresa against Hitler, there's a standard that's different from both Mother Teresa and Hitler, and you're comparing Mother Teresa and Hitler to that standard. You're seeing how they measure up. You're admitting there's a real morality out there. So there is a real morality out there. And if you say Hitler was evil, you only know that because you have some idea of what good is. And you're saying he's fallen short of that standard. So, bottom line, does evil disprove God? No. Evil does not disprove God. The existence of evil actually presupposes God because objective evil can't exist unless God does. In fact, this may seem a little strange, but evil doesn't disprove God. It may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God. Because evil just points to good. Evil only makes sense in light of good. So there may be a malevolent being out there that is causing some of this evil, but that doesn't mean that there's no good. There's no God. In fact, evil, as we'll see in a minute, can't exist on its own. All right, so that's question one. It doesn't disprove God, but we still have a problem here. We still have a problem because it seems emotionally anyway that God should get more involved in stopping evil if he's really out there. So the question is, did God create evil? Let's look at the problem. Here's the problem. We'll put it in a logical format. God created all things. Evil is something. Therefore, God created evil. Now, if these two premises in this argument are true, God created all things and evil is something, that particular conclusion necessarily follows logically. So we're going to have to find a fault in one of the two premises. in order to say that God didn't create evil. So which of these two premises do you think is false? God created all things, or evil is a thing? Evil is something. What do you think? This is the interactive portion of the program. What do you think? Well, it's a 50-50 shot here, okay? And this is what Augustine was struggling with about 1,600 years ago. He had this same problem. He's looking at this argument going, man, which one of these am I going to say is false? Actually, the problem premise is premise 2. Evil is something. In fact, let's state the solution. Here is the solution. Evil is not a thing. It doesn't exist in itself, only in another. Evil's like a parasite. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. Evil is a corruption of a good thing. Here are some examples. Evil is like rot in a tree. If you take all the rot out of the tree, you've got a better tree. But if you take all the tree out of the rot, you've got nothing. You see, evil doesn't exist by itself. It's a parasite. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of the car, you have a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, you've got nothing. Rust doesn't exist on its own. Evil is like moth holes in a garment. If you take all the holes out of the garment, you have a better garment. If you take all the garment out of the holes, you got nothing. A totally moth-eaten garment is a hanger. It doesn't exist. You with me on this? So Augustine made these distinctions quite a while ago, and I think came to the right conclusion. Evil is a parasite. It doesn't exist by itself. It exists only as a corruption in good things. So the summary, of course, is that by granting free will, which we'll see here in a minute is really the cause of evil, God made evil possible, but by misusing free will, we made evil actual. Who created evil? We really did. God created the possibility, but we made it actual. Okay, so evil is not a thing. It's a lack in a thing. It's a parasite. It doesn't exist on its own, so God didn't create it. Now, some of you are going to go to a verse somewhere in Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah 45, where God says, I create evil. We'll come to that. Just hold on. But the main point here is that evil is not a thing, so God did not create it. So point 3, what's the source of evil then? What's the source? We know evil doesn't disprove God. We know God did not create evil. He created the possibility of evil. We created the actuality of it. But what is the source of evil? Well, we just kind of hinted at it. The source of evil is free will. Free will. What do we mean by that? Well, there's at least 3 kinds of free will out there. Free will of human beings. Human free will makes love possible, but also evil. Why do we need free will? Because if we don't have free will, we're just robots. And if we're just robots, we can't love. God decided that a moral universe is what He wanted. So if you need a moral universe, you need to give your creatures free will. But the problem is, when you give them free will, you give them the ability to do evil. And we do plenty of evil. Just look at the newspaper every day or the internet. It's everywhere. Now, this world clearly is not right. Adam's sin, if the Bible's true, left the world in bondage to decay. Now, I'm going to assume from here on out the Bible's true. As I said, the arguments for that are in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, but we're just going to assume it's true at this point and use what the Bible tells us about evil and how we got here as truth. So this world is not right. Adam's decision left the world in bondage to decay. In fact, Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 8, as we have here, Romans 8:21. The universe, the creation, is in bondage to decay. But of course, as we'll see later, the end game to this whole thing is that everything is going to be put back to a pristine condition, a right condition. God's not going to just scrap creation. He's going to restore it to the way it should have been prior to the fall. You see, if you had to sum up the Bible, the whole theme of the Bible in one word, what would the word be? Redemption. That's it, right there. Good. Redemption is the theme of the Bible. You've got paradise lost in Genesis and paradise regained in Revelation, and everything in between is the story of that redemption. That's what the whole thing is. Redemption. God will redeem the creation which went bad because of our free will, misusing our free will. We are responsible for most of the world's evil. At least directly anyway, we are. Because when you think about what goes on, there is natural evil out there which ultimately is indirectly caused by our sin because the world is tainted because of our sin. But we do a lot more direct evil to one another. We murder, we steal, we rape. I don't need to go on. You know what goes on out there and what goes on in here too. Now, I hear quite a bit that Christians and even non-Christians say, well, look, if there's a good God out there, why doesn't he just stop all this evil? Why doesn't he just stop it? He's powerful. Why didn't he stop it? Because if he stopped it, he might start with you. And he might start with me. Notice how we're always pointing at the other guy. See that guy over there? He's evil. Stop him, God. Of course, when we're doing that, we're also guilty too, because we do evil every day, don't we? See, if God stopped all evil, he'd stop all free will on this earth anyway. We'll still have free will in heaven, by the way. We'll talk about that later. But we won't have the desire to sin anymore. Won't have this negative environment either. But right now we're in a fallen world. If God stops evil, he stops free will, which means he stops love. He stops it all. So if he wants to keep a moral universe going where people can still make free choices here on earth in this fallen world, he can't just stop all evil. If he does, the whole gig is up. Now there's also Satan's free will too. If there is a being out there called Satan, and of course the scriptures say there is, demonic forces may be allowed by God to produce a greater good. In Job, probably, maybe the first book written in the Bible, talks about Satan coming into God's area and saying, hey, coming before God and saying, you think Job is really a servant of yours? Let me at him. He's not gonna stay loyal to you after I get at him. And you all know the story. Just about everything is taken from Job. Ultimately, he asks God for an explanation. The ultimate explanation is you just need to trust me. So the moral of the story, I think, for Job is trust me. You're not going to be able to understand everything that happens to you. Of course, Job's wife was saying, curse God and die. Job was saying, no. He made me. I can't curse him. But there could be demonic forces that cause some evil. There's also God's free will. God can cause what we perceive as evil to come upon us. In fact, the Old Testament is certainly filled with it. God allows evil to produce a greater good. In Genesis 50:12, that's where Joseph says to his brothers who had originally sold him into slavery, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. Does good ever come from evil? Oh, all the time. In fact, we're going to see some examples of it here a little bit later. All the time. And of course, God may use evil to judge disobedience. Some evil may be judgment for disobedience. Some evil certainly is judgment for disobedience in the Old Testament. But it really kind of, more than annoys me, it shows you, I think, how ignorant some people are. When you hear people today, after some tragedy occurring, some theologian will come out and say, well, this is because we're too pro-homosexual in this country. And that's why God brought 9/11 on us. You've heard some theologians say that. Now, of course, that could be true. But there's no way of knowing it. God hasn't revealed that to us. So why don't you just keep your mouth shut about it and just say, We don't know why this happened specifically, but we do know why it happened generally, because we're all sinners. How do we know? How do we know? Well, actually, the Scriptures tell us. If you go to Luke 13, take a look at Luke 13 for a second. I'm glad this section's in the Bible, because this clears up a lot. Talking about falling towers. Luke 13. There were present at that season some who had told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, and Jesus answered to them, "Do you suppose that these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered such things? I tell you, no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." He doesn't say that these guys were worse sinners. He said, you're sinners too, and unless you repent, it's going to happen to you as well. Whoa. So now you got all these theologians after 9/11 go, it's because of the homosexuals, it's because of abortion. Whoa, hold on. Read the Scripture here. Katrina hit New Orleans because all the sin in New Orleans. Oh, really? You know, it didn't really take out the French Quarter. And literally, we could make a case that every city, every town in America could be wiped out by God at any point, because we're all sinners. How come He doesn't create a hurricane to take out San Francisco? Because God is patient, wanting all to come to repentance. We can't go around saying God caused this specifically. We might say generally, yes, this is the wrath of God. But don't make believe you know why specifically. Then he goes on to say, or those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them. Do you think that they were worse sinners than all the other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Now that's a stern rebuke there, isn't it? Don't point your finger at somebody. I know why you're in trouble, because God is judging you. Well, He might be, but you don't know that. He hasn't revealed it to you. And He could judge you just as much. You know the answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? The real answer is this. There are no good people. We're not good people. There's only one good person that's ever lived, and He's our Savior. Now, we may be better than other people. You may compare yourself to other people and say, I'm better than so-and-so. Paul actually warns you against that in 2 Corinthians. He says, those who compare themselves to others are not wise. That's the problem. We're always comparing ourselves to other people rather than comparing ourselves to the standard. You know? So, keep in mind, yes, it may be judgment for disobedience, but you can't, at least on this side of the revelation, after the revelation has been closed, unless God does a miracle and reveals it to you that this is why it happened, just keep your mouth shut about it, okay? Say, yeah, it might be judgment, but I don't know what for. How about sin in general? Now, objection. How can God do evil? Here's an objection we got to deal with, right? We're saying here that God didn't create evil, but we're saying He may bring evil. So how can He do evil? Isn't judgment evil? And doesn't Isaiah 45 say something about, I create evil? In fact, if you've got a Bible, take a look at Isaiah 45. Is that what it says? That God actually creates evil? Well, didn't we already just point out that evil's not a thing? So how could God create it? What does He mean? It's actually verse 7 of chapter 45 of Isaiah. And actually, if we're good theologians here, we're going to read the whole chapter. We don't have time to right now because we need to understand the context. But basically, he's talking about using Cyrus as judgment. And he says, I am the Lord, we're really starting here in verse 6. I am the Lord and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create, some translations say what? Some say evil, but the proper translation is calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. God does bring calamity. God does bring judgment. To us, it's evil. But does that mean God has done evil? First of all, here's some points we need to make. What is evil for us isn't necessarily evil for God. What do we mean by that? Well, for example, since God created life, He has the right to take it. In fact, He eventually takes all our earthly lives from us, doesn't He? If God sends a hurricane in and wipes out some people because they're sinners, and we're all sinners, is that evil for God? No. He's the creator of life. He can take it. And actually, He does not really kill people, technically. He just moves their location. Okay? They go from this life to another life in another form. God can do that whenever He wants. It would be evil for one of us to kill a whole bunch of people in a city. If we could create a storm or just go in there with a gun, that would be evil for us, but it's not evil for God. He's the creator. Also, since God knows the ultimate outcome of all things, He can bring good from what appears to be, to us anyway, purposeless evil. Some call it gratuitous evil. There's no good thing that comes from it. God can, and as we'll see here in a few minutes, there are ways He can do that. And Christians, of course, believe what? From the famous verse in Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those that love God and are called according to His purpose. Doesn't say all things are good, because not all things are good, but all things can work together for good. And do work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. Doesn't mean all things are good. Now, when you talk about this, you got to talk about a big objection you'll get, and we get this on college campuses a lot. How can you believe in a good God when He committed atrocities in the Old Testament? He wiped out the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the termites. He wiped them all out. Is that right? Is God genocidal? What's the deal? Now, this would actually take a whole class in itself to go through. I'm just going to give you some bullet points here to think about. Actually, William Lane Craig, the guy who wrote the book Hard Questions, Real Answers, has a website, and he has a number of questions on there, and he goes into great depth in answering this. So if you really want a more detailed answer, I suggest you go to reasonablefaith.org. Reasonablefaith.org. It's linked off of crossexamined.org, so if you want to go to our website, you can get there too. And just look up his answer to the Canaanite problem. But let me just give you a few points here. First point is, you might ask an atheist who brings this objection up, if there is no God, why is murder or any other Old Testament atrocity wrong? In other words, don't bring a standard of morality to this issue because you don't have a standard of morality in your worldview. You keep arguing against God, saying God is immoral, much like Christopher Hitchens does, when you don't have a standard of morality from which to argue. If we're just molecules in motion, there's nothing wrong or nothing different about killing a hill full of ants or a hill full of people. They're just chemicals. What's the point? No ultimate difference. But they might come back to you and say, yeah, okay, I can see that, but how do you deal with this in your worldview? Now, that's a fair question, right? I mean, if there's a good God, why does He do this kind of thing? All right, well, let's ask a couple other questions. Is God arbitrary, or does He give reasons for judging people in the Old Testament? Does He just come out of nowhere and say, yo, kill these people? Does He do that? What does He say? He's waiting for 400 years, trying to get their attention. He's trying to say, look, hey, you need to get out of the land, and you're doing all these abominable things. You're sacrificing your kids to gods, your gods. You're burning them. You're doing all these evil things. Stop it, stop it. After 400 years, a patient God finally said, that's enough, I've had it. Now, the bigger question isn't why did God wipe these people out? The bigger question is, why did He have the Israelites do it? Right? Why? He could have just said, you're dead. Like He did to, who was it, who lost 185,000? Sennacherib. He's outside the city and God just decided to say, okay, you guys are dead. Enough. Why did he have the Israelites do it? Well, we could talk about that another time. It's an interesting question. But the main point here is that he's not arbitrary. He gives reasons for judging people in the Old Testament. And you know, it's very interesting that you have atheists today who say, why doesn't God step in and stop this evil? And then when he does in the Old Testament, they complain. I mean, if there was a whole group of people out there today who were sacrificing their kids, like we're doing here in this country, through abortion, we might say, stop it. Well, we don't really say that about abortion. But if we had really, say, infant children or toddler children, and we knew of a society that was taking these children and sacrificing them and burning them, we would cry down God's judgment on those people, wouldn't we? So here in the Old Testament, he does that, apparently. And yet atheists are going, why? How can a good God do that? Well, wait. If he is good, maybe he should do that. You keep complaining he's not involved. Then when he gets involved, you complain about him being involved. You can't have it both ways. By the way, it's not genocide either. Because when the Israelites were disobedient, he wiped them out too. Now, next question. Is God committing murder by ending lives on earth? Is he committing murder? Can God murder anyone? No, he can't murder anyone. Why? Because he's the creator of life. And as I said before, he can take life. In fact, he doesn't really kill people. What he does is he changes their location. God has the right to usher people into the next life, whether they are 2 years old or 82 years old. People never die, they just change location. He doesn't tell us that we're going to live 70 or 15, or we're going to live to 70 or 75. In fact, if everyone was guaranteed to live to 75, what would most of us do? We'd live like hell till 74 and 364 days, wouldn't we? And we'd say, okay, God, I'm ready. So he doesn't guarantee that. Finally, the relevant questions are, does God exist and is his will expressed in the Bible? I mean, it could be true, if the Bible obviously is questionable, that the Israelites just thought God was telling them that in a spirit of nationalistic fervor, and they went and wiped these people out, and then they tried to justify it by saying, hey, God told us to do this. I mean, that's a possibility here. But if the Bible's true, then God is certainly justified in ending lives, just like he's justified today in ending lives. And of course, he gives us some reasons for doing this. So while this is a difficult problem, I don't think it's an intractable problem. And as I say, if you want more on this, go to reasonablefaith.org and look up Craig's answer on this particular issue. All right, so evil doesn't disprove God. God didn't create evil because evil isn't a thing. He created the possibility of evil. We created the actuality of evil. What's the source of evil? That's free will. What caused free will? What caused Lucifer to sin? Lucifer. There's got to be a first cause, right? You can't say what's behind the first cause. There's got to be an uncaused first cause, and in the case of sin, Lucifer was the first to do it. So now the question is, what's the purpose of evil? Before we get into the purpose of evil, why don't we just take a few minutes for questions now, and then we'll take a break and come back and do points 4, 5, and 6. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit more about the absence of, like darkness is the absence of light?
Yes.
So is evil the absence of God? I mean, is there any scripture about that?
Well, men love darkness rather than light, we could say, because their deeds were evil. Evil is a lack in good. It's a privation in good. It is a parasite in good. We might say evil is a choice to go against the will of God. Okay? A sin is evil because you're going against the will of God. Look, there is no morality if there's no purpose, right? There has to be a direction to life. What is the purpose of life? which we're going to talk about here in a minute. What is the purpose of life? If you stray from that purpose, you're doing evil. If you're consistent with that purpose, and particularly God's will, then you're doing good. Okay, evil is not a thing in itself, but it's bound up in choice. When you make the choice to go with God, you're doing good. When you make a choice to go against God, you're doing evil. Okay, now, an interesting point here is that some think that Christianity is dualistic. What do I mean by dualistic? That there are equal and opposite powers out there. That there is a good God and an equally powerful evil devil. And then he has his demons and God has his angels and they war all the time. Well, there is a spiritual battle going on, but there's no such thing as absolute evil. Even Satan is what we would say metaphysically good. He has an intellect, that's good. He has free will, that's good. But he uses it to go his own way, away from God, rather than good. There is no such thing as a purely evil power, because in order to achieve what an evil power wants to achieve, he's normally using bad means to achieve a good end. What's a good end? Well, it's a good end to, for example, have power. That's a good thing. Power is a good thing. Free will is a good thing. Having other creatures worship you would be a good thing. Now, it's not good if you're not God, because it inflates your ego. But the devil is after good things, but he's using an evil means to do it. And when you think about why do people do evil here on earth? Let's take crime, for example. People commit crime for what? To get money or sustenance. Those are good things. The Bible does not say money is the root of all evil. What does it say? The love of money is the root of all evil. When you will violate God's will in order to get money, then that's an evil thing. But money itself is not evil. We need money. Money's a good thing. Power is a good thing. Free choice is a good thing. Pleasure is a good thing. But when you go in order to get pleasure or any of those other things away from God, then you're doing evil. So evil alone can't exist. The devil is a fallen angel. What does that mean? It means he has good attributes. He has intellect and free will and all that, but he uses it in a bad way to try and get good things. Yes, ma'am.
I'll try to phrase this the best way I can, because you run into this a lot when you're doing street ministry. You have people that'll say, well, I'm not going to play with God, so I'm not going to get saved and sin,
right,
knowing that I have the intentions to sin. So what would be the difference in a non-believer who says, okay, I'm going to sin freely, knowing that I'm not playing with God, versus a Christian who decides to get saved and continues on with sin? Is there a different measurement? Is there a different standard because of the consciousness that comes along with the acts of sin?
Well, I would argue that both people in that example you gave are conscious of God. One is simply saying, I'm not going to accept him, and the other saying, I am, even though I know I will sin after this. And we've all done that. You don't become perfect when you become saved. Sanctification takes your entire life, and you never quite get there. The person who says he's not going to play with God doesn't have that option. Everybody's playing with God, right? God rules everybody. Ultimately, he'll rule. God reigns in hell too. You think Satan reigns? Satan doesn't reign in hell. God is in control of hell too. He just doesn't put his loving presence there. What is hell? Hell is separation from God. You say, well, why does God create hell? Because he has to quarantine evil, as we'll see here a little bit later. He has to quarantine it. He doesn't really destroy it. He just quarantines it. And people who go to hell get what they want. Maybe not what they desire, but what they ask for. They want to be separate from God. For example, the guy I debated, Christopher Hitchens, admits for him to go to heaven would be hell for him. He doesn't want to have anything to do with God. He can't spend an hour in church. He's going to spend eternity in heaven? No. It would be unloving for God to force people into heaven against their will. So whenever somebody asks me, well, you just think that only you're going to heaven, or you have to believe your way to go to heaven, or, why would God leave all those other people out of heaven? I always say, do you think it would be loving of God to force those people into heaven against their will? God gives you what you choose. So this guy over here you're talking about who says, well, I'm not gonna play with God and say I'm a Christian and then do all these sins, really doesn't have that option. He's going to be judged either by his own deeds or by Christ's righteousness imputed to him. And if he becomes a Christian, he has Christ's righteousness imputed to him. And so he will not be punished in eternity for what he did here. He may lose rewards if he becomes a Christian, like we can lose rewards for not doing good works, and Christians do so. If we don't do good works for the right motives, we can lose rewards in heaven. But a guy who stays outside the kingdom's judged already. It's not like he's going to decide, well, you know what? If I don't become a Christian, God has nothing to do with me. No, that's not the way it works. God has something to do with everyone. Yes, sir.
I've heard the argument before that God created Satan for the purpose of bringing destruction so that God in some way wouldn't sin, because he created the devil as an instrument to do those things so that God wouldn't be held accountable to that. How would you answer that with someone that would argue that?
Well, if God never created anything else, then he would never sin anyway, because that's one thing God can't do is sin. He can't violate his own nature. So if God didn't create Satan, there would have been no sin. If God didn't create Satan, and maybe he just created us and we freely chose to fall away, still it wouldn't be God who did sin. God is never going to do sin, okay, because he is a being that cannot sin. There are several things God can't do. He can't sin. He can't violate his own nature. He can't go out of existence. He can't suddenly say, I'm not God anymore. He can't make a square circle. Okay, these are attributes these are impossible things. So, we're talking about hypothetical things here. If God doesn't create Satan, but he creates humans, will humans ultimately fall? Well, we don't know. Hypothetically, yes. All right, welcome back. As you know, last time we were here, we covered the first 3 points of this very difficult problem, if God, why evil? The first point, does evil disprove God? And we said, no, it doesn't disprove God, because you wouldn't even know evil unless you knew good, and you wouldn't know good unless there was a standard outside yourself of good. And that standard is an objective, immaterial standard that theologians, of course, say is God's very nature. So evil doesn't disprove God. It may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God. The next question is, did God create evil? Because if God created all things and evil is a thing, then God created evil. Now that's a problem for the Christian, to think that God created evil. God's not supposed to be able to create evil. He's supposed to be pure and good. But we came to the conclusion that Augustine came to about 1,600 years ago when he said, evil is not a thing, it's a lack in a thing. Evil is like rot in a tree. You take all the rot out of the tree, you have a better tree. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of the car, you have a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, you have nothing, right? So evil's not a thing, so God didn't create it. God created the possibility of evil when he gave us free will, but we created the actuality of evil when we misused our free will. The third point is, what's the source of evil? And I just hinted at it. It's free will. And there's at least 3 kinds of free will that we spoke about last time. There's human free will. We do a lot of evil. Why doesn't God end all the evil in the world? Because if he did, he might start with us. He might start with you. He might start with me, because we do evil all the time. So human free will is one reason for evil. Now you say, well, why would God give free will? Because in order for there to be love, you have to give free will. So if God wants a moral universe where people can make choices, he has to give free will. He has to give free choice. The problem is he opens it up to evil as well. And as we'll see here in a minute, good can come from evil. So God had reasons for giving us free will and allowing evil. Also, other sources of evil might be Satan's free will or demons' free will or even God's free will. If God wants to bring judgment on us, he can. And as we spoke about last time, it is not unjust for God to kill us. In fact, he's the creator of life. He can take it. But when he kills us, he doesn't really kill us per se. He just changes our location. We go from this universe in this life to another life, assuming, of course, the Bible's true. And in this particular presentation, we're assuming it. If you want to get more evidence that the Bible's true, our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, goes into it. That's where we ended last time. What's the purpose of evil now? We'll cover what's the purpose, what's the destiny, and what should you do about evil in this session. All right, what's the purpose of evil? That's a good question. Well, the first thing we need to point out is that we are on this road, or a road in this life, which does not end in this life. It goes right on into eternity. But let's ask the question, what is the purpose? There can be no purpose for evil unless there's a purpose of this life. What is the purpose of this life? What is it? Why are we here? Is life just a glorified Monopoly game? Get a whole bunch of stuff now because when the game is over, it's all going to go back in the box? Is that why we're here? Is that what life's about? If it is, by the way, we're wasting our time here tonight because I'm not going to tell you how to get more stuff. I don't think life is a glorified Monopoly game. I think there is a true meaning to life. But the true meaning, you might be surprised to find out, is not happiness. We are not God's pets. God just doesn't have us for his amusement, and he doesn't just have us to give us a comfortable life. That's not the reason we are here. It's not the purpose for this life. So what is the purpose then? It's redemption and growth. The Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit, amen. He doesn't say go make believers. What does he say? Go make disciples. There's a difference. The purpose of this life is not just to be redeemed. Remember, the whole theme of the Bible, in one word, is the word redemption. You have paradise lost in Genesis, paradise regained in Revelation. And everything in between is about redemption. Now, in order to get redeemed, you accept the free gift of salvation that Christ has accomplished for us. And then you try and spread that message around and grow yourself. And we'll talk about growth here in a minute. So the purpose of life is both redemption and growth. Now, how does one get redeemed? Well, we just mentioned it. The way you get redeemed is you love God and one another, the greatest commandment, Matthew 22:37. And you know God through Jesus Christ and make him known. Everybody's purpose in life is to know God and make him known. And when I say know, I don't just mean intellectually, I mean volitionally as well, relationally. The Bible talks about, in James, it says, even the demons know that there's a God. They just don't put their trust in him. There's a difference, in other words, between belief that and belief in. You can believe that there's a God. You can believe that Jesus rose from the dead. You can believe that the Bible's true and still not be saved. Because you don't want to be saved. Even the demons know that it's true. You have to believe in God. Now, what does apologetics do, by the way? That's what we're doing here. We're giving evidence. Apologetics speaks to belief that. It gives you evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Bible's true. But there's no evidence to believe in God. There's only evidence to believe that he exists and that the Bible's true. You don't need evidence to put your trust into somebody. You just need to have evidence that this person exists. So the whole big debate between faith and reason is really a misplaced debate. Reason has to do with evidence. Faith has to do with putting your trust in somebody. I'll give you an example. When I first met my wife, her name was Stephanie Dolan at the time, I got evidence that she would be a good wife. I got to know her, and I had evidence that she would be a good wife. But just the intellectual assent that I had, that she would be a good wife, did not make her my wife. I had to take a step of faith and put my trust in her. And that's what we have to do with Christ. In fact, marriage, as you know, is an illustration of what our ultimate marriage is to Christ. This earthly marriage is just an illustration of what our marriage is to Christ. So if you're going to be married to Christ, you don't just have to believe that he exists, but you have to put your trust in him. If you want to have a wife or a husband, you don't just have faith that they'd be a good spouse. You have to put your trust in him or her. That takes a step of faith and trust. So, knowing God intellectually and relationally and then making him known. Now, everybody has a different way of making him known. There are different gifts in the body. That's why we come together as a body. Why do we come together as a church other than to worship? Why? We come together to equip the saints to do ministry. Ephesians chapter 4. The pastor doesn't do all the ministry. The pastor does what he does, and he equips you to go out and do it. See, you're the ambassadors. There are no lay people in church. Everybody's a priest. You're a royal priesthood. You're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, says Peter. You know, there's a big debate between the Catholics and the Protestants. Catholics, of course, have priests and laity, and Protestants say, well, we don't need any of that. We just have our own little, everyone's kind of equal. We have elders and all that, but there's really no clergy. I think both are wrong. Why? You don't do away with the priesthood. What you do is you do away with the laity. There's no laity. Everybody's a priest. Everybody's a disciple. Everybody's out there doing God's work. And no matter where you are, you're supposed to be doing God's work. No matter what you do. We talked about this in the first night, right? There's no bifurcation between the sacred and the secular. Everything is secular for the Christian. No matter what you do and where you do it, you're an ambassador for Christ. So our mission here is to know God through Jesus Christ and make him known. And as I mentioned on night one, that actually was the charter for Harvard University. The purpose of this institution is to teach young men, it was just a man's school at the time, to know Jesus Christ, God the Father, and eternal life. That's it. Harvard had it right in 1636. They've fallen quite far away at this point, but they knew what the purpose of life was. So how does one grow? We know how one gets redeemed. The question is, how does one grow? Usually through pain, rarely through pleasure. Let me ask you guys a question. How many of you came to faith through pain? Okay, probably about half of us in this room right here came to faith because of pain. How many have learned some incredible lessons through pain? Okay, almost everyone. How many have learned some incredible lessons through pleasure? Few of us, but not nearly as many through pain. Usually, the lessons you learn through pleasure are, you don't really learn much through pleasure. That's the lesson you learn. Or you may say, if I get too much of this, it'll take me down the wrong path. Or you may say, no, this is a good pleasure and I ought to seek more of it. You can say that too. But most of our lessons come through pain. Let me ask you guys another question. What would happen to you if you got everything you wanted? What would happen to you? Suppose everything you prayed, you got. What would happen to you? Would you grow as a human being and as a follower of Christ, or would you atrophy? I submit to you, you would atrophy. Why? Because your prayer life would become more about you and less about others and more about what you wanted rather than God's will. And it would cause you to be even more selfish, to become even more selfish than you already are. Think about it. When a child gets everything he or she wants, what do we call that child? Spoiled. Why do we call the child spoiled? Because their character is spoiled. Because they don't learn virtue from getting everything they want. They learn to be more and more inward focused, more and more selfish, rather than more loving and compassionate, rather than deferring, rather than putting the other person first. They want everything. I mean, tragically, look at all these entertainers who die these tragic deaths. They're just adored. They have all the money. They have all the fame. And yet they're miserable. They get everything they want. All they have around them are yes men and yes women. I mean, look at Michael Jackson. We don't know all the ins and outs of this situation right now, but apparently he's been given drugs by several doctors, drugs that weren't just painkillers, they were like anesthetics. And nobody stood up and said, no, I love you too much, I'm not going to allow this. What happens to people who have everything to live with and nothing to live for? They atrophy. They become all about themselves. They don't become followers of Christ. They become basically consumers. Consumers of everything they want at the expense of maybe what other people in their lives want. Becomes all about them. I don't know Michael Jackson's personal life. I'm not doing a commentary on Michael Jackson here. I'm just saying that if you got everything you wanted, you would become less and less like Christ rather than more and more like Christ. So let me point out one other thing. If you're ever watching TV, Christian TV, and you come across somebody on the TV who says that if you have faith and if you send me money, you're guaranteed to be healthy and wealthy. If you ever come across that nonsense on TV, turn it off and tell every one of your friends not to watch it, because it's absolute bunk. Jesus said, in this life you will have trouble, but take heart, I will overcome the world. The healthy, wealthy, name it, claim it gospel is an absolute crock. If those who have a lot of faith are going to be healthy and wealthy in this life, then Jesus and the disciples did not have enough faith because they were brutally tortured and killed for what they believed. Don't tell me that that's what the gospel is. That is a false gospel. So if you're ever watching TV, and unfortunately Christian TV is dominated by this nonsense, then move on to somebody else. And I could name names here, but I won't get into it right now. I don't have time for it. But you can look up on the internet some of the names of these people who are teaching this garbage and are giving all of Christianity a bad name. It is a false gospel. Paul talked about this in Galatians chapter 1 when he talked about legalism. If anybody's preaching to you a Christ other than the Christ I'm talking about, may anathema be on him. They're talking about a different Christ. They're not talking about the crucified Christ, whom we're called to suffer with. You're never going to grow if you get everything you want. So, redemption, evil and pain humble us and bring us to God. If we're going to be redeemed, as you already in our survey have shown, a lot of times pain will bring you to God. C.S. Lewis again said it probably better than anybody. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. He also said, sometimes you only look up when you're on your back. Why did Jesus say it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? Because the rich man is secure in his life. He doesn't need God. He thinks that he's got it made. He doesn't need anybody. There's no dependence. If you got everything you wanted, you wouldn't depend on anybody. Now, Jesus said it was difficult, hard for a rich man to get in heaven. Didn't say it wasn't possible. There are plenty of rich people who are Christians, but it's just difficult. Why? Because the riches of the world crowd out the true meaning of life. Jesus said, blessed are the poor. Also, there's a fabulous proverb that many of us probably don't have the courage to pray. It's Proverbs chapter 30, where it says, Lord, give me enough so I don't steal and curse your name, but don't give me too much that I forget about you. You ever prayed that? Give me just enough, God. Just enough so it's adequate, but not too much that I forget about you. I mean, I know a lady who was actually a massage therapist for Google when Google hadn't really emerged on the stock market. And she was wise enough to say, I want some of my pay in stock. Is that okay? They said, sure. She is a multi-millionaire now. You know what she told me recently? She said, sometimes it's hard getting out of bed. Because I used to live day to day, excited to see how the Lord was going to bring finances into my life. And He always brought it in just in time. Now I've got all this money in the bank and I don't see that anymore. She said there's a guy working for her who used to work at Google and is now retired with $100 million who can't get out of bed in the morning. He just has lost all will to live practically. He's got everything made from a world's perspective. You say, well, he's just messed up. Give me the $100 million. I'll show you how to live. Hey, if money made people happy, we'd be the happiest nation in the world. But we lead the world in suicide, drug use, divorce, all sorts of indicators of unhappiness. Why? Everything to live with, nothing to live for. We're consumer society. Try and get everything we can, and then we keep realizing it doesn't satisfy, but we say, if I just get the next thing, it will. And if I just get the next thing, it will. If I just get the next thing, it will. Then we spawn these churches that say, if you come to our church and you have faith and send us money, you'll be able to get the next thing. Is that absolute bunk or what? Also, God uses pain to humble us. After Job had questioned God, why did you allow all this evil in my life? Here is one way God responded. He said, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like His? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor and clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath, Job. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Look at every proud man and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. Whew. Don't mess with God. He's basically saying, obviously, you're not in control. You think you're in control. You think you're in control, but you're not. I am the standard of justice. And you're questioning me. He went on to say, basically, Job, you can't even understand the physical universe. How do you think you're going to understand the moral universe completely? A couple minutes will explain why God doesn't always explain every particular evil. We're to trust God. Now, how does God achieve a greater good through evil? Actually, the Scriptures tell us. James 1:2, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now, we always think trials are painful, and quite frequently most of them are painful. But I submit to you that sometimes trials are when everything goes very well for you and you're tempted to forget about God. Be careful in those situations. But here, James is talking about the fact that the testing of your faith produces patience. And patience may lead you, or patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. In Romans 5, Paul says, we also glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Other scriptures related, of course, to what evil does. I mentioned this before in the last session when we talked about Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, you intended to harm me by selling me into slavery, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Because you remember, Joseph was in a position of power in Egypt, so he could help the Israelites who were in famine. So what was meant for evil ultimately turned out for good. Are there ever situations in our current situation now, or our current era, where what somebody meant for evil turns into good? Of course. Not just then, but now. In Hebrews, the writer says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness. Discipline is necessary. Just like discipline is necessary for our children, discipline is necessary for us. because it produces a harvest of righteousness. When you can develop somebody's character through discipline, then it becomes much easier for them to live a holy life, and they can then enjoy the benefits of a holy life. When someone is undisciplined, they can't enjoy the benefits of a holy life because they're in bondage to sin. Freedom is not doing what you want to do. Freedom is being able to do what you know you should do. That's true freedom. That's why in heaven we'll be free, because we can do what we know we should do without being tempted to do evil. What's the purpose of evil? The first is redemption. The second reason is growth. The purpose of life is redemption. The second reason is growth. Now, let's point out here that a redeemed person can grow unlike an untested person. In fact, some theologians argue, and I think it's a good argument, that after you're redeemed, you actually enhance your character to the point that you go above where you would have been if you had never sinned. In other words, your state of redemption will be a better state than if you had never sinned, than if you had been in Adam's condition prior to sin. You say, how so? We'll get to that in a minute. But let me just give you an illustration just from business. Do you know that a customer who has a problem with a company and then their problem is resolved in a very quick and efficient manner has a stronger loyalty to that company than somebody who has never had a problem? Why is that? Because you've earned something with that customer, right? You've redeemed the customer. You've made the bond stronger. This is even true of relationships that we have, right? If you have a falling out, you can have a stronger relationship after you make up. You've been through that difficulty. Now, that's not to say sometimes there aren't scars from that. There could be. But you can have a stronger relationship because you've solved the issue and you have a deeper bond at that point. Now, we don't sin against one another so we can enjoy redemption. But when it does happen, we can actually turn an evil into a good. Now, how does this work on a bigger scale? Some virtues can only be developed through evil and pain. For example, you can't develop courage without danger. When those boys came off those landing craft at Normandy in 1944, they had to somehow harbor, or they somehow had to develop courage to do this. They could never develop courage unless there was danger. It's not an act of courage to attack a beach that nobody's on. It's only an act of courage to attack a beach where there's resistance. By the way, you can't develop a good character unless you resist temptation. C.S. Lewis has a good analogy here where he says, you don't learn how strong the German army is by giving up. You learn how strong the German army is by resisting it. The same is true when it comes to temptation. You don't enhance your character or learn about temptation by giving in. You enhance your character by resisting it. And so some virtues can only be developed through difficulty. You can't develop courage without danger. You can't develop perseverance unless there are obstacles in your way. If you got everything you wanted every time, your character would never develop. It would atrophy. It would go the wrong way. You'd become a spoiled child. You can't develop compassion without suffering. You can't develop patience without tribulation. You can't develop character without adversity. And you can't develop faith without need. That's why, again, it's difficult for the rich man to get into heaven. Because he has no needs, perceived needs. Now, basically, no pain, no gain. You say, why do we go through all these difficulties? Paul talks about this, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that outweighs them all, that far outweighs them all. The difficulty you go through here on earth will enhance your capacity to enjoy God in heaven. You say, how can that be? Let me just give you an illustration from sports. It seems trivial after talking about the boys who invaded Normandy, but I'll just give you an illustration because we all understand sports. Most of us do in here in any way. And I'll give you an illustration from a couple of years ago. I grew up in New Jersey, so I've been a New York Giant fan for many years. Although I'm starting to like the Washington Redskins now, believe it or not, because I just spent some time with their coach, Jim Zorn, who is a strong Christian. So there's a guy you want to root for, Jim Zorn, the coach of the Washington Redskins. In any event, a couple of years ago, after being in New York for about 4 years, Eli Manning went on a big run, as you know, and actually in the playoffs won 4 road games, including against the New England Patriots, an 18-0 undefeated team that was trying to make history. And you all know about the miracle catch to David Tyree, who was a Christian, by the way. And just an amazing, amazing game, an amazing season. Now, before that, he had taken all sorts of abuse in New York. It's not easy playing in New York, right? Oh, they should have never drafted you. They should have drafted Rivers. Should have never traded for you. You'll never be as good as your brother. You're just mediocre. You're never going to make it. Took all sorts of abuse. And then, as you know, he went on that run and won not only the Super Bowl, but he won the MVP. And here he is holding up the Lombardi trophy. Now, let me ask you a question. He went into the locker room after the game, and so did the third-string quarterback who didn't play a down all year, right? Now, the third-string quarterback was happy to be there. He enjoyed it. But do you think that Eli Manning enjoyed it more? Why? Because he went through all the difficulty, all the abuse, all the trials, all the tribulations, all the people who said he couldn't do it. He actually, through all the difficulty, enhanced his capacity to enjoy the victory. Now, that's exactly what can happen to us. When we go through the difficulty here, and by the way, in America, we don't have difficulty compared to other countries. But we go through difficulty here, it can actually enhance our capacity to enjoy God forever. You develop character here. Now, somebody who lives a very nice life can still be in heaven, obviously, of course, due to the sacrifice of Christ, but they may not develop the capacity as somebody who goes through a lot more difficulty here on earth. So when you go through trials, as James says, count it all joy. Nobody would choose to go through trials. That's why God doesn't put pain in our control all the time. But yet pain can bring us eternal rewards. Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Now you're going to get an objection when you say this, though. You're saying, yeah, I can see how some of these things can enhance somebody's capacity. I can see some good for some evil, but surely there's got to be some gratuitous evil out there. I can't think of a good reason why that boy would spend 10 days under a building only to die after rescue workers couldn't get to him after the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. I can't think of a good reason why that girl would swallow water for 10 days while rescuers couldn't get to her, and she died a torturous death in that Columbia mudslide. I don't know if I can think of good reasons for the Holocaust or 9/11 or Katrina. So what do you say? Well, let's take a look at the objection again. There's no purpose for some evil. My first question is, how could you know that? How could you know that? You're finite. You have a limited perspective. You're here on this earth for a very short time, and you have a very limited tunnel perspective while you're here. Not that you can't know many things, you can. But can you see the end from the beginning? Can you see how all this works together? No, you can't. I can't. I can't see the end from the beginning. I'm seeing a very small snippet of history, much less eternity. in a very remote part of the world, or a small part of the world, in a very small circle of people. Secondly, only someone with an eternal perspective could know what the ultimate outcome of evil events are. Specifically, this earthly life is not the end of the story. With billions of interacting choices made every day, every evil may result in good either now, later, or in eternity. The ripple effect. What do I mean by the ripple effect? Well, think of tossing a rock in a pond. The ripples go out from them, right? Well, ripples go out from everything we do that may affect us immediately, it may affect other people immediately, or other people later indirectly. Have you guys ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? What's the moral of It's a Wonderful Life? What's the kind of the overall moral? You know, Jimmy Stewart and Christmas, and he wants to commit suicide, and the angel rescues him and shows him what life would have been like if he had never been born. Remember that? The moral's what? That every life is a wonderful life because it has an impact that you can't even see half the time. You don't know how your very presence can change history. You don't know how your very presence can change and affect other people. You have no idea sometimes. And in that movie, he was given the opportunity to see what his absence would have done. The inverse of that is to see what his presence actually did. And he was able to see it immediately, the effect on the town. We don't know how an act that it can occur today may ripple through history, and 500 years from now, it might have an impact, a positive impact for God. A lot of people ask me, why would God create people who he knew he would go to hell? First of all, they freely chose to go to hell. But secondly, are you a believer? Oh yeah, you're a believer. Was any of you the people who are in your family tree, were any of them unbelievers? Oh yeah. You would have never gotten here if it wasn't for unbelievers. You've got unbelievers in your history, don't you? You may be married to unbelievers. Unbelievers who are your kids, your parents. Now maybe they'll come to faith someday. Maybe they won't. But everybody has a purpose. Everybody has a reason for being here. And we freely have the choice to decide what we're going to do with our lives. And we don't know what our effect's going to be. But just because we don't know doesn't mean that there might not be good that comes out of evil. In fact, I don't know the why for some evil, but I know why I don't know why. Because I'm finite and God is infinite. Can I give you general reasons why evil occurs? Yeah, we just have. Can I give you the actual specific reason why a specific evil occurs? No, I can't. God hasn't revealed it to me. The author of life hasn't told me the whole story. He simply said, trust me. Now let's go back to what Craig talked about. When he talked about the girl who died and the young boy who died, those tragic deaths. Here's what Craig says. He says, in the first place, both incidents concerned natural evils intertwined with human moral sin, I should say. The whole of Latin America has been victimized by an unjust and uncaring upper class, which has, in its lust for power and wealth, exploited the masses, leaving them poor and underprivileged. The suffering of those two children is indirectly attributable to this corrupt and unchristian system. For if the societies in which the children lived were following Christian principles, their families would not have been forced to live in unsafe housing that was improperly located or so poorly built that it disintegrated under the stress of earthquake or rain. In a world free from sin, it's possible that neither of these tragedies would have taken place. Hence, man must shoulder some of the blame for these evils. Now, why did God permit these children to suffer so? He says, I don't know. I don't know directly. I don't know all. I have possibilities, but I don't know the specifics. Perhaps, and he's speculating here, of course, perhaps through the tragic death of this boy, God knew Mexican authorities would be shocked into requiring new construction standards for earthquake-proof buildings, thereby saving many future lives. Maybe he let it happen because the authorities would be so shocked. Maybe he permitted it so that some other person facing death or illness in a hospital and seeing the reports on television would be inspired by the boy's courage to face his own challenge with faith and bravery. Maybe God permitted the Colombian girl to slowly drown because he knew that only then would her family or somebody else turn to faith in him and repentance. Or perhaps he knew that only through such a terrible incident would her family move away to a place, or even their descendants might in turn come to be influenced or to influence someone else for Christ. We just don't know. But because we don't know doesn't mean there isn't a reason. Because there are billions of interacting things going on here. In fact, he goes on to say, but maybe there wasn't any earthly reason why God permitted those catastrophes. Maybe they served no earthly good whatever. Perhaps the catastrophes were simply the unfortunate byproduct of natural, geologic, and meteorologic laws, and the children unlucky victims. But God permitted this suffering in the lives of these children in order that they and their families might be driven to deeper dependence on Him. He goes on to give other possibilities. The point here is that these evils don't disprove God. We know why we don't know, even though we don't know. Now, some might say, and again, I think we need to keep this in perspective as well. Remember, when you got to look at this in context, there's a lot of great evidence, I say overwhelming evidence, for the existence of the biblical God. This evidence, evil, actually doesn't work as strongly against God as we think. So even though there's an emotional objection here, and that's really what it is, it's not an intellectual objection. We know that God could have a good reason for it. We just don't know what that particular reason is. The good evidence is there that God does indeed exist. Now, one other objection you're going to get, well, wait a minute, if there is a good reason, why doesn't God just tell us? Why doesn't He tell us why that girl or that boy suffered? He could give us the reasons, couldn't He? Well, first of all, He does generally tell us why evil occurs in the Scriptures. But what about specifically? He does not for specific events because, and I'm speculating a little bit here, but I think these are good reasons. Because number one, it would require individual revelation for each event, which might be too difficult to comprehend due to the ripple effect of outcomes into the future and eternity. I mean, think about having to explain how all these billions of interacting choices go together throughout history. You'd never be able to explain it. You just trust me. It's all going to work out in the end. That's what God says. Just trust me. You lose a baby. The baby dies. You think there's no reason for it. Just trust me. Somehow, it may be 500 years from now, it's going to bear big fruit. You say, what about the baby? That baby died. Yes, but where's the baby now? It can bear fruit in your life by becoming stronger. You become stronger, and then you can comfort others, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians. We suffer so we can then comfort others who are suffering. There may be a number of reasons why. Also, if God had to give individual revelation for everything that occurred in your life, this life would become like a haunted house, right? Everything that happened, okay, what happened here? You'd never grow up, would you? You know, the best quarterbacks in the league are the quarterbacks that go out into the game and don't have to look at the sideline for everything. They may get a lot of plays from the sidelines, but a lot of times they got to go out there and improvise, don't they? Because they have character, because they've been developed under pressure, because they can recognize a situation and say, I'm going to call this audible here. You develop more when you have to get out there on your own. If your father or your mother told you what to do every single step of the way your entire life, you'd never grow up. Secondly, such individual revelation might negate the good ripple effects of suffering by altering the behavior of those who receive it. Okay, I see, God. Now you explain it to me. Okay, now I'll never do that again. So the good effects may never come to you if you knew the reason why, right? So God can defeat the good effects by explaining what the good effects are, because by explaining it to you, it causes you to change your behavior and the good effects don't come. You see what I'm saying? So, summary. Evil is real, but with regard to belief in God, it's an emotional, not an intellectual problem. It is emotional. It still bothers me, and it should bother you. but I can see intellectually why it doesn't disprove God. Finally, what's the destination of evil? Do you know that only Christianity can explain evil? Skeptics out there are always trying to say, oh, you Christian, how can you believe in a good God with all this evil in the world? Well, you know, evil's a problem for you too. I don't care what your worldview is. What do the pantheists say? Like Buddhists, they say evil is really imaginary. I'm saying evil is real, not imaginary. Buddhists say it's imaginary. Oh, please. That's just nonsense. It's real. It's not a thing, but it's real. Atheists say that evil's subjective. I'm saying evil is objective. It's not subjective. It's real. It's out there. It's not just my opinion the Holocaust was wrong. It's not just my opinion that what bin Laden did was wrong. It's not just my opinion that murder's wrong or that torturing babies for fun. That's really wrong. Atheists can't say that. And in their hearts, they know it is objectively, morally wrong. Evil's origin and persistence are explained. As we pointed out, free choice and a greater good. And evil ultimately will be punished and quarantined by Christ. In the end, there will be perfect justice. And what we lost in Revelation, we regain what we lost in Genesis, I should say, we regain in Revelation. Let's read the end of the book. Revelation 21. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Amen. What does it mean to go to heaven? It means to enter God's rest. Do you know how cushy we have it here in America? Yet life can still be a drag, right? Life can still be difficult. I like that. Enter God's rest. There's going to be a day when you're just going to enter His rest. All the trouble, all the difficulty, all the hardship will be over. That's true rest. So the bottom line is, this is not the best possible world, just the best possible way to get to the best possible world with free creatures. This isn't the best possible world. One less murder, one less rape would make it a better world. But this may be the best possible way to get to the best possible world with free creatures. We've sinned, now we can be redeemed. And pain helps us with both redemption and growth. So what should you do about evil? 2 things. Number 1, get redeemed. If you're not redeemed, get redeemed. Get saved. Love Him who first loved you. God doesn't need to justify Himself before us. We need to be justified before Him. See, we're just pointing at God. Why are you doing this? God. He doesn't have to justify Himself to us. We have to justify ourselves to Him, and the only way we can do that is have Him do it for us. He does it for us. We just have to accept it. Secondly, work hard because you're working for God. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making His appeal through us. God is making His appeal through us. So, the point here is God's solution to evil is He wants you to help while we're here. We're His ambassadors. God sends us to deal with evil. We truly have an ultimate purpose here on earth, to know God and to make Him known, to deal with evil. And you know, one of the most amazing things about this issue of evil is God did not spare Himself from it. God Himself, the creator of you, me, and everyone, the creator of this universe, subjected Himself to us in order to save us. If there ever was an instance of a bad thing happening to a good person, here it is. He did not exempt Himself from evil. He came to defeat it, and in order to defeat it, He had to submit Himself to it. Think about that. That's the kind of God we serve. Christ came. He did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, right? He gave himself. He submitted to evil on our behalf. Now, some may say, well, I really don't need anybody to pay me off. I don't need a ransom. I'm a pretty good person myself. This is what I was talking about before. We kind of have a relative moral standard in our mind. From the moral giant, Mother Teresa, to the moral midget, Hitler. And next to Hitler, we put criminals. We know they're bad, but they're not just quite as bad as Hitler, but they're bad. Next to criminals, we put the immoral people. The immoral people you and I both know. Our friends and relatives who aren't quite as good as we are, because we put our picture right here. Next to Mother Teresa. We know we're not quite as good as Mother Teresa, but we're working on it. We're getting there. And what we do is we draw an arbitrary line right down the center there, and we say, everybody on the right, they're bad, they're going to hell. Everybody on the left is good, we're going to heaven. So you and Mother Teresa are on your way to heaven, and all your evil friends, relatives, criminals, and Hitler are going to hell. I submit to you, although this is the way it's commonly thought of in America, this is not the way the universe really works. The line does not run up and down. The line actually runs across the top. And God's perfect standard shows us that we have all fallen short. And what Christ has done is he has come and bridged the gap between our iniquity and his perfection. That's what he's done for us. In other words, Christ's purpose for coming was to be punished in your place. He sacrificed his life for you. Now, recently, I debated Christopher Hitchens on the issue, does God exist? And in Hitchens' book and during the debate, he had mentioned that Christ's sacrifice was immoral. Now, as I mentioned before, it always amuses me when atheists say anything is immoral because they have no moral standard by which to judge anything immoral. No objective standard. I mean, if we're just chemicals, Christopher, then where do you get this immaterial standard known as morality? If somebody does something wrong, you can't blame them. There's just molecules going off in their brain, just chemicals reacting. And there is no such thing as right or wrong. It's just chemicals. But put that aside for a second. He said the sacrifice of Christ is immoral. So in my rebuttal of the last debate, here's how I tried to answer that. This is Petty Officer Second Class Michael Mansour, who was a U.S. Navy SEAL operating in Ramadi, Iraq. In May of 2006, he won an award, a military award, for rescuing a fallen comrade. He went into incredible danger to do so. He rescued his comrade and won the award. A few months later, in September of 2006, in fact, it was September 29th of 2006, he was with two other Navy SEALs in the town of Ramadi, and they were trying to clear out insurgents. They were on the outcropping of a roof, and the two Navy SEALs that were with Mansour were out toward the edge of the roof, and Mansour was near the door. Some insurgent from an unknown location, a terrorist, threw a grenade. It actually hit Mansour in the chest and hit the ground. Now, Mansour easily could have just leapt through the door and saved himself. But if he had done so, the other two SEALs surely would have been killed. He had a choice to make in about 1 second. What do you think the choice was that he made? As he yelled grenade, he dove on the grenade. The fragment grenade detonated, and 30 minutes later, Michael Mansour was dead. One of the two Navy SEALs that was with him got a small piece of shrapnel in his leg. There were no other injuries. One of those two Navy SEALs said later, Mikey looked death in the face that day and said, "You cannot take my brothers. I will go in their stead." Now, when Mansour did that, He saved 2 people. April of 2008, President Bush called Petty Officer Mansour's parents into the Oval Office to give him or give them his Medal of Honor posthumously. And here's what the president said. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Mike's life is the way different service members all across the world responded to his death. The president wept through this whole thing. You may have seen some of the pictures. Army soldiers in Ramadi hosted a memorial service for the valiant man who had fought beside them. Iraqi Army scouts, whom Mike helped train, lowered their flag and sent it to his parents. Then nearly every SEAL on the West Coast turned out for Mike's funeral in California. As the SEALs filed past the casket, they removed their golden tridents from their uniforms. Now, I don't know if you know much about U.S. Navy SEALs, but U.S. Navy SEALs are probably the most elite fighting force anywhere in the world. They have to go through literally hell. They have what's called Hell Week during their training, where they get about 4 hours sleep for the entire week. But their training is about 6 months. They train in Coronado, California. Mansour failed the first time he tried to get through the training. He went through it again. Now, when I was in the Navy, I earned navigator wings, which are hard to get, but it's nothing like getting Navy tridents, Navy SEAL tridents. It's a gold pin. So the president said, then nearly every SEAL on the West Coast turned out for Mike's funeral in California. As the SEALs filed past the casket, they removed their golden tridents from their uniforms, pressed them into the wall of the coffin. The procession went on for nearly half an hour, and when it was all over, the simple wooden coffin had become a gold-plated memorial to a hero who will never be forgotten. Now I ask you, is sacrifice immoral? Mansour experienced evil for the good of 2 people. He gave his life for 2. And when he did, there was nothing the other SEALs could do to earn it. It was a free gift. Christ lived the perfect life and died for all. And there's nothing any one of us can do to earn it. Is sacrifice immoral? Is facing evil and taking evil for the benefit of others immoral? No, in fact, Christ told us that wasn't the case. What did he say? He said, the greatest way to show love for friends is to die for them. That's what Christ did. Christ defeated evil by facing it and dying for it, or dying for us. He faced evil and lived the perfect life and then died for us. The only worldview that can answer why evil is Christianity.